video will run through the exam question that asks you to focus on the presentation of the older generation in an inspector calls. One thing to note here, this really is a character question. Typically every year you get a question that focuses on a character, a question that focuses on a theme. For this one, it seems like it's a theme with it asking you to focus on the older generation, but really it's asking you to focus on the two main characters that represent the older generation, those being Sybil Burling and Arthur Burling. So view this question as a character question and see it as an opportunity to join all the information you have. So you should have even more material to explore, considering you can explore two characters for this question rather than one. So as soon as you get a question like this, you have to think about which characters represent the older generation. Because what you don't want to do is talk about Eric and Sheila for the whole essay and not really answer the question, although they might come in handy later. So the two main characters are Mr. and Mrs. Burling. There are other characters that you could explore. I haven't in this video, but of course there's always a different way to answer the question. So you could have looked at the Crofts, Gerald's parents, who aren't present on stage, but they are referred to, so they are characters. Same for Joe Megarty and the inspector as well. Useful characters to highlight contrast with the older generation would be Eric Burling and Sheila Burling. So it's fine to talk about characters who do not represent the older generation, but only if it helps you reflect on how the older generation are presented. So you could include some information on Eric and Sheila, but I wouldn't spend too much time on it because you'll lose focus on the question. And another one would be Gerald. What I did notice with some students' responses is they refer to Gerald Croft as if he was a representation of the older generation. He isn't. He's somewhere in between. He's not quite the younger generation, and he's not the older generation. But you might argue his character is very similar to Mr. and Mrs. Burling. He seems to uphold the same values as they do. So you could explore the parallels that are drawn between Gerald Croft and the other Burlings, but I would avoid exploring him as a character that represents the older generation. So just be careful with the wording if you do include Gerald in your answer. So here are some ideas of quotations you could explore. By no means do these have to be the only ones. First of all, you'll want to think about overall arguments. So what was the purpose really of having the older generation? And in this case, the older generation, because they are Mr. and Mrs. Burling, they represent a capitalist ideology. They are capitalist. It doesn't mean that all of the older generation in the time that this was set represented the capitalist ideology, but just so happens that the characters in this play are capitalists. So they represent that capitalist ideology, and they were used really to expose how self-serving, how stubborn, and what a danger to society this capitalist ideology was. You might argue that the overall purpose, therefore, is to provoke a new idea of social justice by calling into question the behaviour and ideology of the upper class. So you also have to think about the playwright's intent. So that could be kind of your overarching argument that would be in your introduction, and you're continually feeding back into that argument as you explore the different characters. So there are lots of different ways you could have structured your answer. You could have focused on each character, Arthur and then Sybil, separately. You could have put them together and thought about how similar their characters are in certain ways. That's up to you, but I've just done it just so it's easier for this video. I've done them separately. So let's look at some other techniques. So look at Arthur Burling in the way that he uses personal pronouns. So when talking about his daughter Sheila's engagement to Gerald, he says, "Your engagement means an awful lot to me." Look at the personal pronoun here. And then again, a man should look after him and his own. So we often see him use the personal pronoun. So already that represents how selfish Arthur Burling is. Even during a celebration for his daughter's engagement, he's talking about himself and how it makes him feel and how important it is to him. So he's an incredibly selfish character, which links again to this capitalist ideology that Priestley would argue was self-serving. And then think about what he thought about in terms of kind of social responsibility. Early on in the play, he says community and all that nonsense. You might want to zoom in to nonsense and talk about the dismissive tone he uses when referring to social responsibility, like it isn't important whatsoever. So again, that again links to this capitalist way of thinking. There's a lot of dramatic irony used with Mr. Burling, especially, and there are so many quotes. I could have used the one about the Titanic. I know many of you did, for instance, but he referred to war as impossible, and because the play was written in 1945 but set in 1912, by the time the audience sit down to watch this play, they've had 2 world wars, so they know it's not impossible. So it makes Arthur Burling seem really ignorant about current affairs. There he is, standing in front of his family, speaking these long monologues as well. So you might want to include the fact that he speaks at length, and speaking in declarative sentences as well, such as saying war is impossible, and being so wrong about it. So there's an ignorance as well to this character. Then think about the way he refers to the working class. This is when he's really talking about Eva Smith, who is a representation of the working class, and he refers to them, to his workers, as cheap labour. So really focusing on the use of, especially even just labour, the noun labour, shows that he objectifies the working class. He fails to see their humanity, and therefore that affects the way he treats them. Again, throughout this play, obviously Inspector Gall is talking about the suicide of Eva Smith, and lots of things come out of this. One of them being, it suggests that Eric potentially raped her, but definitely had an inappropriate relationship and used her and ended up getting her pregnant and so on. So there's lots of things to be absolutely horrified about, including the way Mr. Burling was anyway. But, you know, he should be horrified that his son has behaved in such a way. But what does he do? He repeatedly talks about public scandal. This will be a public scandal. So again, it shows how selfish he is, but the only thing he really, really cares about is his public image. He doesn't really care about the lives of anyone outside of his household. Then towards the end of the play, when they think they've been tricked, and he calls up to see if there is actually an Inspector Gall, and there isn't one, he thinks they've just been the victims of a hoax, and he says, well, here's to us. So what do we see from the beginning of the play to the end? He hasn't changed. Look at that personal pronoun again. So you'll want to show your understanding of the development of this character to get points for your knowledge of the play. And in this case, there is no development. He stays the same. He starts with using personal pronouns. He ends with them. Well, here's to us. So what does that tell you? That this older generation that represent the capitalist way of life or way of thinking are stubborn. They're incapable of change. And to support that as well would be the stage directions where he behaves triumphantly, like he has won. Again, just showing his ignorance, because little does he know that there are going to be there's going to be 2 world wars. There's going to be an economic depression, and so on, until all of these things are going to happen, and the audience who watches this play will know that. So he has made himself look incredibly ill-informed and overly confident about his situation. So moving on to Sybil Burling, we instantly see from her demeanour, which is relayed through the stage directions, that she's a rather cold woman. You might argue that she's behaving in a very stereotypical manner of a woman of upper class who would be kind of encouraged to be very stoic, to not show their emotions, to take themselves very seriously. So instantly we have this kind of cold-hearted impression of her anyway. But look at how naive she is as well. When Sheila talks about Gerald going missing one summer, she didn't really get to see him much. She lectures, you might argue, or patronises Sheila and says men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. Now that's quite naive, because we later find out that the reason why Sheila didn't see her Gerald at that time is because he was having an affair with Eva Smith. So there's a great naivety to Sybil Burling, even though she's very self-assured, very much therefore like Arthur Burling. But also it suggests that she supports this patriarchal society. It's absolutely fine for a husband not to, or for a partner not to go and see his girlfriend, not to go and see his wife, because he's got business to care for, and that's more important than a woman. So she, you might argue, also is quite in support of that patriarchy, and we will see with Sheila that there's a contrast there. That doesn't really sit well with Sheila. Something else that shows her naivety is when she gets shocked to hear about the way Alderman Megarty behaves in the bars. So the use of the kind of exclamative speech, again, just shows her naivety, how out of touch she is. That's quite ironic. I'm going to skip a little bit, but the fact that she refers to Eva as girls of that class, that dismissive tone, that judgmental tone, says that she believes that the working class had less moral, or lower morals, if you like. But actually, look at the actions of Gerald. Look at the actions of Alderman Megarty. These men with high social status and even titles. Look at the actions of her husband and her son, and her daughter and herself. So the irony there, that she is looking down upon someone like Eva Smith because she's of that class, meaning working class, yet she hasn't really looked at the class that she belongs to. So again, very, very ignorant. You might talk about the irony of her using the word duty. Okay, she doesn't seem socially responsible whatsoever. She's on the board of a charity that turned Eva Smith away and was really quite heartless. Little did she know she was turning away the mother of her grandchild, and that would lead to her committing suicide. Looking at her language as well, he ought to be dealt with very severely. There's something quite authoritative about this verb ought. Okay, so she presents herself as if she knows exactly the way one must behave, or one must react to someone or something. But this is dramatic irony, because at this stage the audience are sitting there and they've already put all the dots together and realised that the inspector is talking about Eric. Eric is the father of the child, but she hasn't quite clued up yet. And we know on stage Sheila also has clued up, and she's begging her mother to stop talking. So again, she just isn't presented as a very intelligent person, and maybe that just comes with her ignorance again, that she's incapable of looking inward and really considering the actions of her and her family. And again, at the end, not just Arthur Burling, but Sybil Burling also, the stage directions often say triumphantly. She behaves triumphantly. So again, they feel like they have won, and little do they know they've got a hard time ahead of them with the wars, the social unrest, and the economic depression ahead of them. So dramatic irony again there, and of course talk about structure. She doesn't, she refuses, she's so stubborn, she refuses to take responsibility. I consider I did my duty. Okay. And then other quotes that you might want to explore that will help contrast with the characters and highlight more about them are here. So Sheila, for instance, when she's saying, "Now, mother, don't you see?" This is when Sybil Burling is really putting her foot in it, and she's saying he ought to be dealt with severely, not realising she's actually talking about Eric. But the questioning of Sheila, you might argue, is her challenging or encouraging her mom to see things through the eyes of the inspector, which Sheila has been able to do. She also challenges as well at the beginning of the play when Arthur Burling refers to the working class as cheap labour. She says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they are people. So she's contradictory, she's challenging. The use of the noun people shows her ability to view the working class with humanity. So even early on we see that Sheila has great capability of change. And then we see that in stage directions towards the end of the play, when she's often described as behaving hysterically or wildly. And that's in great contrast to her mother, who is very stoic and rarely shows any emotion. But what that shows about Sheila is she's capable of great change, to the point that she's almost going through this great transition that's making her behave hysterically and wildly, because she has she's finally realised the weight of what they have all done, and the consequence of their actions, whereas Mr. and Mrs. Burling aren't really moved by the inspector as much. So Sheila's a good one in terms of her capability of change, and contrasting that to her parents' inability to change. I'll go to Eric, because Eric's quite similar. So you could say the same thing. Eric also challenges his father. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? So again, the use of the question shows that he also challenges this capitalist mentality. So early on, we know that he's also capable of change, and in the end, he starts to mirror the language of the inspector. So the inspector uses collective pronouns in contrast to Arthur Burling, who uses personal pronouns, which obviously is because the inspector supports this idea of social responsibility. So Eric eventually says, we all helped to kill her. So he realises that they all play a part, that they are all socially responsible. But Arthur Burling and Sybil Burling are incapable of taking on that responsibility. There's plenty more that you could have done, but that's the main thing. I think so long as you link the older generation with a capitalist ideology, and you can then explore the idea that they are stubborn, they are ignorant, and they're incapable of change, they're heartless. So long as you could kind of tick off those boxes, then you would have been on the right track.